gentlemen, Tom Garwood, making this video outside the Danish embassy to show them how Denmark can be in pole position regarding the crisis over the purchase of Greenland by the United States. You have to begin with a figure that can deal with this problem, and the figure is a modern 21st century Joseph, 77. Now, the biblical Joseph understood Pharaoh's 2 dreams, meaning 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. To me, as a 21st century Joseph, it means the entire era which we call colonialism during the past 500 years represents the 7 years of abundance. The famine is our evolutionary development symbolised by Stonehenge. That symbolises an era where we had not understanding of how to deal with all the challenges of life. For the past 500 years, depicted by the graphic or the draw, in which Christendom and all other religions resided within the culture created of art and science. The important thing to know, ladies and gentlemen, is that I believe that exactly replicates a biblical scenario in which Moses led the Israelites out of the bondage of Egypt, and during this journey God downloaded all the laws of art and science, or rather all the laws for Moses to implement into the Promised Land. Now when the journey came in sight of the Promised Land, God imposed upon Moses to abdicate so that the Israelites can understand that the journey was successful under Moses' leadership, and Joshua was being prepared to take his place to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land. Now I am in the same position as the biblical Joshua, in that I can lead Britain, Europe and America into the Promised Land in a very specific way. As a future Archbishop, Monarch and Pope, these titles you will find in my life, they are imposed upon me, so to speak. They're not something I seek to be. They are imposed upon me by divine providence and the things that I say and done, in which events point to that endorsement. Now, the journey that we are at now ended round about the 1950s, when God was satisfied that what he did on a much bigger scale to create the entire fabric of Western culture came to a satisfactory conclusion. And through me, he imposed upon the British monarch to conclude the hereditary line. Why? Because they flanked that era, and because that replicated Moses' journey across the desert. The constitutional conclusion to the hereditary monarchy does exactly the same as what God imposed upon Moses, but on a much more bigger scale. And that is what I've been saying for the past 20 years, that the Queen and the royal family needs to understand this message. But let me pass that for now. Because the Queen reigned for 70 years past that span, what she has done is to endorse for us to secure what created that era, and not to replicate colonialism. So the British Empire, which she vowed in her 21st birthday speech to save, she can now say, because she died 3 generations after her acquisition, she now saying to King Charles and the royal family, abdicate to symbolise that God has done this for humanity, to create Britain, Europe and America. Now, where we are now, ladies and gentlemen, is to try and put ourselves in the 1950s, because that is where our journey is going to begin into the promised land. And it begins with emulating the culture in terms of literature. Now I've got a booklet here. Called Revive All. And what I've done, ladies and gentlemen, I've given rebirth to Britain's manifold anthems like Land of Hope and Glory and Jerusalem. I've given rebirth to great hymns in Christendom and rebirth to Shakespeare's sonnets, because those reflect, in terms of literature, what that era created. So because of this booklet, I believe that is where the journey can start, with this booklet. And I've turned it into a festival culture service on Christmas Day. But that's past now. But that can be used as a service in every cathedral and every Anglican church in order to get us in the position of the 1950s. Now, how this will help America is very simply this. We all know that America made her mark around the world since the 1950s and up to the 1980s. That is where American expansionism made a mark in the world. And America became very prosperous during that era because of the impetus of that era. We need to understand it in that context. Britain and Europe became great in the sense that it created their very culture alongside Christendom, the face of the world. Now theologically, I'm also saying a message as a future Pope. God was also behind secularism in order to give humanity competent custodianship of an environment in which God can reside through Christ and the church. The church has not taught this. That is what I want to teach, and that will add 90% to the Christian message. Now, how this will affect Denmark to be in pole position in this manner. She can say to America, in order for you to be great again, you need to go through that theological and cultural protocol which this booklet represents. To acquire Greenland on behalf of Western defence, that is perfectly acceptable and the right thing to do. But it's how you come to acquire that is the important question. You can acquire it through an exchange of culture, political, cultural and economic. The wealth underneath Greenland and Canada are the means by which to emulate that culture during the past 500 years. And that is the basis upon which American expansionism can be a successful enterprise. Just to acquire it only for defence purposes is not the right thing to do. There is much in defence in culture as there is in armed conflict, or rather the military. No one can challenge the might of American military might. But the weakness of America now, Mr. President, is in the culture. You are in an excessive regime where you've drifted away from the teachings of the Christian church because it doesn't mean it. Because cultural society manages all those problems such as health, such as industry, education, and so on and so forth. But if I can get the message across that is as important as the Christian, as the relationship with Christ himself, they are both equal. And this little booklet, Mr. President, I guarantee you will give the churches a rebirth, not only in America, but also in Britain and in Europe. So that is the deal that needs to be struck. Firstly, an understanding of the past 500 years and how it came into being, and why it came into being. It came to being because God met with his responsibility to ensure that humanity was blessed with understanding to be a competent custodian. That creates an environment in which all the complexities of Christian doctrine can be glorified. In the middle of a culture of which Stonehenge represents, God's glory cannot be magnified. Do you see my point? Now I want to finish how important it is that we get our mindset, our culture, as it was in the 1950s. Because this booklet can take us to that era. And from that era, we can regenerate all the culture during the past 500 years. Mr. President, I want you to notice that America became great after the 1950s. And this booklet,
This is
could you
Ibrahim.
mind careful that?
I'm doing very well. How are you today?
America became great after the 1950s, up to the 60s, 70s and 80s. So you see, Mr. President, how useful this booklet is